I'm Dennis Hetzel, the Executive Director of the Ohio Newspaper Association. Welcome to this panel on body cameras and open records minefield, which I think everyone in this panel can agree about that. And I want to confess that I'm a biased moderator. I think there should be a presumption of openness attaching to body camera footage. I make no bones about that, and my organization, the ONA, working with the broadcasters and the AP, have been trying to be proactive on this subject for about a year and a half to retain the presumption of openness that I believe the open records law now attaches to this footage. So we don't end up, as some other states have, such as North Carolina, where the openness, they're only released at the discretion of the government, which I think is problematic, but it's not my forum, it's theirs, so I'll leave it at that. My friend Gary Daniels from the ACLU said something last week at a session on open records that I thought is a good intro to this, and I wrote down the quote, I think I have it right. Gary said, "There has never been so much interest in what police do, how they do it, and why they do it." And I think, you know, everyone understands why that is, which of course is why we're here today. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about the landscape that we're in right now with body camera legislation and the law in Ohio. And then we're going to do something a little different. Instead of the typical sort of PowerPoint thing, we're going to play some short video clips and then ask of real incidents captured by police body-worn cameras, and then ask our panelists, I'll introduce in a minute, to react to that footage and what open records issues, public records issues that footage raises. But just very briefly, there are two bills right now pending in the Ohio legislature related to body cameras. My guess, with my lobbyist hat on, would be that we're not going to see either one become law before the end of the year, which means we'll be starting over. I fully expect legislation related to body cameras to reemerge next year. There's probably hundreds of bills. I haven't seen the latest count around the country related to body camera standards, practices, archiving, deployment, expenditures, and of course the open records issues that body cameras raise. House Bill 585 by Representative Antoni is an interesting bill. It preserves the presumption of openness, attaches to the records, and but does create some new restrictions on access, particularly access related to personal privacy. And I think his bill is a good example of why, when you're talking about body cameras, things that seem instinctively obvious, like, well, of course we shouldn't have juveniles in these videos, is not so simple. So, for example, the way the bill is written, if the camera captures a juvenile, the entire video is presumptively closed, as opposed to just a portion of the video from an editing or redaction standpoint. Or what if you don't know the age of people who are in the video? What if the juveniles are peripheral to the video and not the subjects of the video? That's just one of many examples that some of these video clips will illustrate. It's a good, thoughtful effort, I think, on the representative's part to at least get this discussion going. The bill that's been around the longest is House Bill 407 by Representative Boyce. And it's kind of a placeholder bill. It simply says that if you have a body camera, policy, it needs to be a written policy. If you're going to talk about public records, that needs to be, public records needs to be part of it. The bill had a shot at getting out of the House before they went home for the summer. And one of the interesting things, I was at the hearing, the FOP, the police union, showed up at the last minute at the last committee hearing. And you're very rarely in a legislative committee hearing where you're surprised because everything's pretty well scripted. The FOP came in and said they wanted the right to view the video in statute before they write their reports. And that kind of caught some of the legislators on both sides of the aisle a little bit by surprise, raising kind of the devil's advocate questions of, well, the witnesses and the other people don't get to see the video before they give their statements. This is a very important issue to the police union about you know, their ability to be accurate. On the other side, people say, well, you're going to be able to kind of, script your incident report in case it doesn't match what's on the video. And I noticed recently in the agreement the Columbus made with their police union, the officers in Columbus will have that ability. So that's a whole other subject. But that stopped that bill, and I'd be surprised if it becomes law this fall. So that's a little bit of background on the landscape in Ohio. Again, I'm sure we're going to see more after the first of the year. And I should mention there's two pending Supreme Court cases that everyone I know on this panel is waiting for. They're both Cincinnati media cases spearheaded by the Enquirer and other media outlets. One involves dash cam video. The other involves body-worn camera video, which we're going to see a clip from that in a second. And that's going to what the Supreme Court says in both those cases is going to set some parameters on what the current law says about whether this footage is public information or not. And no matter how it comes out, my guess would be it'll guide legislators one way or another in what they want, what they feel they need to do with 14943, our open records law. So let me introduce our panel real quickly. To my immediate right is Peter Bhatia. Peter's a multiple Pulitzer Prize winning editor, particularly during his time as editor at the Portland Oregonian in Oregon. He's currently editor and VP of Audience Engagement at Enquirer Media in Cincinnati. And he was previously director of the Reynolds National Center for Business Journalism at Arizona State's Cronkite Journalism School. To his right is my friend Lou Colombo, who has solved many a problem for Ohio Newspaper Association members for many years as our general counsel, and without question is one of Ohio's top lawyers on issues related to libel, copyright, trademark, defamation, you name it. Lou has been directly involved in a lot of our work with the state legislature on body camera legislation. To his right is George Speaks. George is the Deputy Director for Public Safety in Columbus. He is also an attorney, former Assistant Franklin County Prosecutor. And to give you a size of the scope of his job, the department's budget is $557 million and includes 1,900 law enforcement officers and 1,500 firefighters. And I want to give George and the Columbus PD a shout out. There can't possibly have been a process in the country, whether you agree or disagree with what they want to do in dealing with body cameras, that has been more thoughtful and open than what the city of Columbus has gone through for the last year to try to understand the issue and get their arms around what makes the most sense. And they could be a model for a lot of other PDs around the country in trying to figure out how they're going to deal with body cameras. And then to my far right is Senator Cecil Thomas, who I think is uniquely well positioned to be on this panel. Senator Thomas serves Ohio Senate District 9 in Cincinnati before being elected to the Senate, where he's the ranking member of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee and the State and Local Committee. He spent 27 years in the Cincinnati Police Department. And then after leaving the PD, he became executive director of the Cincinnati Human Relations Commission and was active after the 2001 civil unrest in Cincinnati in ensuring that the community was able to get together and move forward. So welcome to all of our panelists, particularly Senator Thomas. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start showing some videos. I don't think we're going to be able to possibly get through all 7 that I have, but they're all there. We're going to make sure we leave some time for Q&A at the end. And after I show each clip, I'm going to ask the panel to react to what issues they see in these videos. For example, what are unique or unusual sunshine law issues that are raised by this video? Does it suggest changes that need to be made in the law? Should the presumption of openness attach to this record? What should the citizen's expectation of privacy be weighed against the need for access and transparency? Should most of this video, and this is sort of what the Supreme Court case is about, be treated as the functional equivalent of a pre-investigation incident report, or does a lot of it just simply going to fall into the bucket of the confidential investigatory exemption? Should there be restrictions how much of the video can be shown publicly if it shows nudity, violence, depiction of minors? And what about government being in the position of deciding whether a requester's purpose is valid. In other words, the intent of the purpose. What's your intent in seeking this video, which is really a 180 on typical public records law, where the intent cannot be part of the government's consideration. So without further ado, I'm going to start here by showing a video from the Samuel Dubose case, which I assume just about everybody in this room is at least somewhat familiar with. And I'm going to show you a short segment that actually shows the initial encounter and the shooting. Then we're going to talk about that. And then I've got another segment, if I can get to the right spot, later in the video that shows the officers talking after the incident. So hopefully this will work, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the Dubose video.
9233 traffic stop. I'll be on Still Street, just off of Vine.
You by Still Street?
Hey, firm. Still just off of Vine.
It'll be the longest clip you'll be seeing today. It'll be a couple minutes.
Okay, we're slow to stop. We're on Rice Street, just off of Phil, Ohio, George Lincoln North, 6917. Occupied by 1. Hey, how's it going, man?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Officer Tenzing, UC Police. Do you have a license on you?
Yeah, what happened? What was the problem?
Okay. Is this your car?
Yeah.
Let's come back to a female, actually.
Yeah, my wife, her name is Rashawn DeVries.
Okay. We don't have a front license plate on your car.
Oh, I can come out and live about it. I have it.
What's that?
It's right here. I just...
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's got to go where the front plate's supposed to go.
Well, I didn't know.
You don't have to reach for it. It's okay. You have a license on you?
Yeah.
What's that bottle on the floor there?
Oh, the bottle.
Valid registration.
Bottle what?
You can smell it. It's
Valid
it's not that liquor.
Okay. Do you have a license on you? Okay. Do you know what that license had? Is that or what?
Yeah, I got my titles and stuff on that.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you again. Do you have your license on
I
you?
have license. You can take my name.
So do you not have your license on you? I'm asking you a direct question. Do you have your license on?
I thought I did. I understand. What did you pull me over for?
Again, the front tag.
Is it an accident?
But it's not illegal to have a front flag in Cincinnati.
Okay. Actually, it is. I'm gonna ask you again. Do you have a license on you?
I have a license. You can run my name.
Okay. Is that not on you then?
I don't think I have it on me.
Be straight up with me. Are you suspended?
No, I'm not suspended.
Why don't you have your license on you?
I just don't know. I'm sorry, sir. I'm just gonna go in the house.
Okay. Where do you say that? Down here?
Right around the window.
Okay. Well, until I can figure out if you have a license or not, go ahead and take your seatbelt off for me.
I didn't even do nothing.
Go ahead and take your seatbelt off. Stop! I'm good! I'm just driving down the side of the road! I don't know about it! Huh? 33, the car stopped, lanes get right, 1 shot fired. Can you go with me? I'm going to shut the car off. Go!
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, ask our panel to talk about what's your reaction to the video, what are some of the open records issues that you see in this video. Senator Thomas, I'm going to go first.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. In looking at the video, the officer obviously observed what he thought was a violation, no license plate on the front of the vehicle, which is a statute, which is mandatory in Ohio. And then he began to proceed to pull the vehicle over. Obviously, he has his body-worn camera activated as he approached the vehicle. Expectations are that this should be available for public record, simply because of the fact that it is the officer is acting in his duty as a police officer, given the authority to pull the vehicle over based on a violation, which is standard expectations from his superiors. He then proceeds, obviously, to request information from the individual, and lack of cooperation, and we saw what happened. Then the question becomes, well, the officer's side of the story versus what the camera shows. Obviously, I would expect that this would be information that's readily available to be shown. However, there's some considerations that expectations of privacy, or say, of the family in this situation. I don't think the family would want to see this shown over and over and over again because of the trauma that's caused to the family. Should the family have some expectation of privacy in this situation, because he's the victim? So when we talk about this particular situation, I would think that it would be available for review. However, there should be some consideration given to the family as to what should be shown in this situation. I think it could be problematic if it's just ignored, if the family's ignored.
Others? Who wants to jump in?
I'd like to give more of a 10,000 feet overview for a moment to put this in context. So police community relations are at the forefront of our national dialogue and our local dialogue. Body cameras are a centerpiece of that conversation that's going on. What I'd like to do is put this video in the context. In the city of Columbus last year, we received about 1.3 million calls for service. Among those calls for service, over 17,000 domestic violence calls, 5,695 persons with a gun, 2,200 persons with a knife, 6,102 shots fired, 739 shootings, cutting or stabbings, 1,216. I looked this morning, we issued something in excess, somewhere in excess of 20,000 traffic citations last year in the city of Columbus. This is a single traffic citation. What we now know is that any one of these encounters can erupt in community discord. So with respect to your specific question, is this a public record? Well, there's a legal test for that. Does it document the activities of the government agency? Absolutely. A traffic stop documents what the traffic unit does. However, the second question is, would it fall under the confidential law enforcement exception? Yes, I believe it would. But remember, even if something does fall under the exception, the government has a discretion to give that record out, to show the film. In a nutshell, there's your 10,000.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to disagree with George on it falling within the confidential law enforcement exception. This is akin to a routine incident report. It simply documents what happened. It is not an investigation in any sense of the understanding of investigation. There are no special techniques here. There's no follow-up. There's no forensics. There's no ballistics. There's no interviews. There's no analysis of whether or not a crime occurred and who should be charged with the crime. It's simply a reflection of what happened. Okay, the same way it would be a reflection of what happened if the guy didn't have a camera and he went out and this unfolded in the exact same way and he came back and he wrote it up. I stopped the guy, whatever, there was a shooting. That's an incident report. This is the functional equivalent of an incident report, only it's on camera, and the camera doesn't lie. And I will take up on George's comment about this being a significant issue in the community. I've got to believe that 99% of interactions between police and the community go as they should. And treating these as incident reports and making them available will, I think, encourage community confidence in the police, while concealing them or giving the government the discretion to release them is going to just raise community suspicions about what's being made available and what's not. So I would say, I think under the law, they are public records, they should be released, and I think we'll all benefit from it if they are.
Yeah. Peter, and then we'll go back to George.
Add on to that. Yeah, I completely agree with what Lou was just saying, and I think one of the ways to think about it as our counsel in Cincinnati has eloquently expressed it, and he's in the second row, so I have to say that, but is that how can you have something fall under the clear investigative exemption? There can't be an investigation until something happens. So this is completely the equivalent of in the old days, before body cams, of an officer pulling out his notebook, taking notes, writing down, compiling the information that will eventually find its way into his or her written report. The video is just a more technologically advanced way of gathering the information of what has happened. We get to see it in real time. That's the difference. What's really interesting about this whole conversation, debate, whatever you want to call it, that's going on nationally right now, is there's a growing body of evidence that body cams do what I suspected they would always do, which is to affirm that the vast majority of officer-community interactions are handled professionally and appropriately by law enforcement. And one could make an argument, fairly or not, that if there had been body cams in Ferguson, that might have played out completely differently. I don't know, because I don't know which side of the story to believe in Ferguson, because both are intensely expressed. So this trend towards body cams in Cincinnati and elsewhere and across the country, Columbus, et cetera, is ultimately going to serve law enforcement more effectively, in my view, because any of us who've, the vast majority of any encounters that I've had or you've had or our families have had with officers have been with good result. Obviously, the Tensing case, and it's you have to remember where I live. I've seen this video so many times I see it in my sleep now, and the trial is scheduled to begin in 10 days. The final preliminary hearing was supposed to take place this morning. It was delayed. I don't know if it actually came off, but that video is going to be the center of the prosecutor's case as it goes forward in this case. Because of the buffering, if you hadn't seen it before, you couldn't quite make out the key moments, and even when you do, it's hard to see. I mean, because of what I do, and I'm sure same with you, Lou. I've studied it, and the jury's going to have to do the same thing as it goes to trial in a couple of weeks.
George, you want to follow?
I love clash on panels, so this is good. There are three. First of all, I agree with Peter in terms of body cameras. I believe will show will not be incriminating, rather they'll be exculpating in the great majority of cases. However, there's three issues I want you to think about if you accept that all body cameras right away are public records. First, what is the reason for the confidential law enforcement investigation? Why is that in law? Why is that a policy? The reason is you don't want to taint an investigation. So if you automatically say the body camera footage is a public record, then that can taint the investigation. It can change witness statements. It can insert things into an investigation and make them public before that footage can be reviewed and investigated. It can also, quite frankly, endanger folks, depending on what is said, endanger the public. So the very reason we have confidential law enforcement exception is so that the bad guy who did the crime is able to be to be caught at some point and is brought to justice. This mode of thinking, I think, is going to hurt that underlying value. Second, as you're going to see throughout today, there are two values that are clashing here. The first value is transparency. For transparency, you want the camera on as much as you can, and I agree, for the sake of the public, to be transparent, you have to be able to show the public the video. That's why our Columbus Body Camera Committee greatly disagreed with states like Florida, with states like California, in which body camera videos are not a public record. I think that's horrible public policy. What we do need in Ohio, and what our committee has recommended, is some additional public records exemptions. Why? Because you have transparency, the value on one hand, and you're going to see privacy is on the other. And the videos that you'll see throughout the day is going to show this potential clash of those two values. The third, and lastly, is scope, which I'm worried about being a manager. And by scope, I mean this, 1.3 million calls, and I gave you 17,000 domestic violence calls, 5,000 calls, persons with a gun. For the first time, this is going to be a public record. Now, even if the clearest exception applies, remember, once the criminal investigation is over, it becomes a public record. At some point, all this is going to be a public record. The volume of material is scary. I worry about that in terms of redaction. We've had one camera vendor who's opined that redaction is a 4-to-1 ratio. In other words, for every 1 hour film, it may take up to 4 hours to redact that film. That's going to be a significant management issue on our part. The other is simply, again, the raw scope, the amount of footage that's going to be out there, and therefore the cost of storage is going to be a huge issue for everyone.
Senator, you had a
Yes.
follow-up?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to speak from a different perspective here. In most incidents of civil unrest, it usually involves a spark, which is a police negative encounter with a citizen in our communities. Oftentimes, these incidents occur in some of your urban centers in our communities. There's a tremendous amount of distrust that has always been, that goes on within certain segments of the population, the African American population in particular, the distrust between citizens and police. Oftentimes, when I was a police officer, it was always us against them mentality that was going on. If we're ever going to reach a point of public trust, there has to be transparency in policing. All too often, there were incidents of alleged police misconduct, but once it was investigated, it was their word against the citizens' word, the police officer's word against the citizen's word, and the allegation was not sustained. The cameras have now created an environment where you're not seeing a lack of who's telling the truth. I recall often once we got the video cameras in the police cruisers, the dash cams, the complaints of discourtesy went way down. The complaints against police officers, because oftentimes stops occur at night when there's very little, there's people around. And so it became one word against the other. But once those cameras were put into the vehicles and the citizen said, well, he called me out of my name, they would play back the dash cam video and it would pick up the audio if it did not pick up the actual video itself. So the complaints went down. Now that we're seeing cell phones and the fact that this new technology is picking up all of these incidents, and people are beginning to see that what citizens were saying, in many cases, all of a sudden now it's becoming true. I'm not saying that all police officers, it was just a small portion of our law enforcement officers that would not be as truthful as what you would expect them to be, which was causing some of the concerns that citizens were saying, and that caused the distrust. And then all it took was that one spark, which erupted all of the frustration in a community. And that's what we're seeing now. So I would say that transparency, I believe there was a request to not show the videos. And I think the gentleman here has clearly said that it probably should be held as, and not be shown because of situations with witnesses and things of that nature. Well, one of the reasons we had civil unrest in 2001 in Cincinnati was simply because the police chief said, I'm not going to release any information. I'm going to investigate it, and I'll tell you once I've done my investigation. The citizens left City Hall at that point and started tearing the streets up simply because of the distrust and the fact that, well, maybe they're trying to hide something. The cameras do not lie. And all we're saying, and I believe this is critical, is that if you hold on to a video, rumors take a life of their own, and citizens then latch on to those rumors. And that's what we've seen so often. So they should release those videos as soon as possible. I'm not saying right away. It doesn't take long for your prosecutor to do whatever he's going to do, but to hold on to a video for any length of time without...
Flagstaff Police releasing that...
I'm sorry.
Voice of God.
That's all right.
Can I say
But it has to be released.
Sure. Quickly.
Quickly. Very quickly, I agree with what Mr. Speak said to a large degree, but here's where the rub is, and here's why we need to settle this. As I think is clear, I passionately believe that these videos are public record under Ohio law. The court will decide that for one way or another, and then the legislature can react. But a couple things. One is, I don't think any of us in the media would be opposed ultimately to legislation that has some exemptions, reasonable exemptions. I think some of the bills that are before the legislature right now go too far on some of those exemptions. But for example, not showing juveniles, I don't think anybody, at least in the so-called, I know it's a derogatory term now, but I kind of embrace it. Those of us in the mainstream media would accept some limitations like that. Secondly, I think the scope point is a very, very important one for law enforcement agencies, for county governments, et cetera, city governments, to figure out the editing and just the storage of these. Because when you think of the volume of that's what's being produced, that's a real issue, and ultimately it's a taxpayer issue, and that's something that needs to be figured out as we go. The one thing about the discretion that prosecutors have right now that's really troubling plays out in the Cincinnati cases. In the case of DuBose, the video we just saw, the prosecutor initially refused to release the video. We went forward with legal action. Subsequently, 3 days later, 3 days, Jack, he released it in that very memorable press conference now where the prosecutor basically got up and said this was a murder. In a similar case, not a similar case, but in another case in Cincinnati, an officer named Sonny Kim was shot and killed by it was kind of a suicide by cop situation. Guy shoots and kills the officer, responding officer shoots and kills the guy who shot the officer. In that case, the prosecutor held on to the video for many months. And again, we were back in court trying to get it before he ultimately relented and released it. He, not to cast aspersions of any sort, but in my judgment, I speak only for myself and my colleagues in my newsroom, our feeling was he was sitting on it to prevent release of it under the guise of an ongoing investigation. There was no ongoing investigation. It was very clear from the day of the shooting that the other officer, who was the only person who could be investigated, acted properly. His colleague was shot and dying on the street. The other guy's waving a gun around. The officer arrives. He does what would seemingly be appropriate in that situation. So the investigatory exemption can be used to stonewall the public getting information, and I think it was in that case, which is again another reason why I think we need this clarity.
Okay, I'm going to move to another video here that
Hello, sir. How you doing? You enter?
some interesting privacy issues. And what you're going to see in this video is a Cleveland Browns coach, Andy Moeller. So he's clearly not a public official, but he obviously is a public figure, certainly if you're a Browns fan. Officers make a domestic violence complaint call in his home. He's not arrested. It's in his home. It's certainly a matter of some public interest because of who he is. And I'll let the video play out and the panel talk about, some of the issues this raises.
Well, she left and trashed my house. So
Really? All right. Is
I
that
don't know
your
what she
fiance?
told you.
I haven't even talked to her yet, so I don't know. So what happened?
She got mad, and I'm in the middle of cleaning up all the glass.
Okay.
It's all over my house.
What?
And I don't know what she told you.
I
have all this to clean up, and I've been sweeping up the entire the glass here.
What'd you do that for?
And I got glass back there, and I think the windows broke. I gotta look back there.
Well, I mean,
She threw that over there, so.
well, how'd you do all this?
What's that?
I mean, how'd this happen? Did you start?
She's mad at me, and she went off, and sir, that's
Just started breaking stuff?
she threw it all over the wall over there, all over the wall over here, and I'm just cleaning it up. I don't know where she's at. I don't know if
Okay.
you talked to her.
Yeah,
I don't know what
she called.
wants to say.
She went walking down the street.
Yeah, well, yeah, and so I'm
Did it get-
that guy here and all that.
Did it get-
I did not touch her. She's mad. She threw all the shit all over the place. And so I'm sorry you're here. I hate to waste your time.
All right. What is she mad about? What happened?
You'd have to ask her.
She's got
She
upset.
was on the phone with her son when I was on the phone, and then when she got off the phone, she threw stuff everywhere.
Did it get physical between you and her? Did she hit you? You hit her? Or anything like that?
Other than throwing this stuff, that's all.
Okay.
No, I did not touch her. No.
Okay.
Okay, you guys get the idea. He's not charged. It's in his home. It's certainly a matter of some public interest. Public record, open record, closed record, delay. How should you think this should be handled? Who wants to go first? George?
Well, I'll say first and foremost, maybe this partially explains the 0-5 start to a team here.
Among other reasons.
That was last year.
I'm a Bengals fan. All right, you got it. Let me start out with, again, the overview. Domestic violence calls are one of the most dangerous calls that officers go on. So it's very important that the camera be on, I believe, for transparency's sake in those calls. Again, last year, our police here in Columbus responded to 17,925 such calls. Now, as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that this type of footage is going to be incredible. You're going to be able to see blood, bruising, raw emotions in real time or just after the real-time incident. You'll be seeing broken glass and torn clothes, and not only will you be able to see, but you're going to be able to hear. You'll maybe hear a trembling voice. You may hear a very aggressive person in these videos. This will be incredible, very demonstrative evidence that a prosecutor can use. It will also make it very difficult for a defendant to change the story after the fact, and it will be difficult for a victim to recant their testimony, as often, I'm afraid, happens, and the cycle starts again in these domestic violence cases. So for these reasons, there was a Phoenix study in 2014 that found domestic violence cases that the conviction rates substantially increased in DV cases. Now there's another side. There's some folks of the opinion who believe that these types of videos may have a chilling effect. In Ohio, this is a public record. There's no criminal charge filed here. There's no confidential law enforcement exception. Body camera videos, in my opinion, are public records. This doesn't fall under any exception. This type of video is unlike the prior one you saw in that it's inside of a person's home. There's no expectation of privacy, perhaps on the street, as in the first video. Here you're in someone's home. What happens when these videos, when the police go into that private residence? What if you start seeing nudity? There's no exemption for nudity. And that's not at all infrequent in lover spats. What about embarrassing items the body camera will see? Sex tapes, sex items, drug paraphernalia. What about juveniles? What about showing the layout of a home or where a safe is in the home? All of these are issues that Ohio law currently does not address, which is why we've made some recommendations to tighten up and increase some what I believe are commonsensical exemptions, because again, you have the two values clashing of transparency versus privacy.
Who wants to go next? Lou?
It's hard to disagree with much of what George said. He admits it's a public record. We can agree on that. I don't have a lot of sympathy for people who essentially invite the police into their homes by getting involved in domestic violence. It certainly doesn't fall into any classic privacy formulation. It's not an intrusion. The cops have a right to be there. It's not private facts when they've made it a public issue through domestic violence. It's not false light. Camera doesn't lie. You're talking about creating a new privacy exemption for basically stuff that embarrasses people. And if you want to do that, you can do it, but you can imagine all sorts of scenarios, and all sorts of different people have different responses to those scenarios in terms of what should be private and what shouldn't be private. My inclination is you invite the cops into your home by getting involved in violence of one sort or another. You live with the consequences.
I don't know if a domestic violence victim invites a cop into their home.
Well, the person perpetrating the violence certainly did.
It may not be his home.
Well, oftentimes police officers get the call to respond to an incident of domestic violence, and once they're basically trying to determine what's going on and decide what to do next. I think that the camera basically just shows the officer doing exactly what he's trained to do, is to try to mediate a situation as best he can, and if necessary, have to take further action of arresting someone. I have to agree that if the citizen calls and the officer responds, yes, the camera should be on, simply because that incident can spiral out of control very quickly. However, if the citizen says, well, I don't want the cameras on, that's a whole different question. Should the officer then be under a certain policy? If the citizen asks to turn the cameras off, that the cameras be turned off, should that officer turn those off in their policy? Raises a question.
Peter?
And I think one of the things that this raises and the conversation's been really interesting about is this whole notion of privacy and what is it. I'm not sure as a society we've quite decided what privacy is, at least in a legal context. And that's why I think writing laws that try to define what's privacy and what's private and what's not has its perils. I mean, I don't think any of us in the media would object to limitations on showing victims of domestic violence or sexual violence or anything, or dead bodies or whatever the case might be. I mean, those are conversations we're quite willing to have. As an editor, I doubt very much that I would have, if this video had been released to us, I doubt we would have put it on our site, because I don't think it has extraordinary news value other than he's a Browns assistant coach. And in the last minute and a half or so of the video that was not shown here, the officer asked him 4 or 5 times, did he touch her, did he hit her, did physical violence take place? And he denied it, and he denied it, and he denied it. So in this specific case, based on what we have here, the newsworthy test, which is the one that we apply to everything, of course, is not met. That doesn't necessarily resolve the legal question, but that part of news judgment comes into play on all these things as well.
Jack, sure.
Mr. Speaks, I guess I'm interested in your comment because that is in no way a subject to clear, because I think you could make an argument that that's more like a clear record.
There's no charges filed.
If I could finish, that's more like a clear record, I think, than the initial stop. An investigatory record is one that relates to a law enforcement matter that was initiated by a call to the police saying that there was an incident of domestic violence at the home. The police then, so that makes it, I think, a law enforcement matter. So that's a record that relates to a law enforcement matter.
Agreed.
That's the first part of clear.
Agreed.
The second part of clear,
Agreed.
does it identify an uncharged suspect? You said
no,
he was never.
That's not the test, though.
That is the test. It's a 4-part test. Does that identify an uncharged suspect? And if that guy was not charged, and I would say that the police are at that point. They've gotten a call. A wife's, somebody in the house says, I was a victim of domestic violence. The police go, now they're kind of investigating. I think that's way more like a clear record than the traffic stop in the DuBose case.
Whether or not something falls under the exemption of a law enforcement investigatory, a confidential matter is a 2-part test. First, is there a law enforcement matter? In this case, absolutely. Second, is there a high probability of disclosing the identity of an uncharged suspect, is what you raised. In this case, there are no charges filed. There are no suspects. It is not a criminal.
He's been identified
by
the wife. And he wasn't charged. Of course he's a suspect.
So, okay, let's go back.
He's uncharged.
Let me finish.
Okay, fair enough.
Let's assume that you're right, and it was. Then when they decided not to file charges, it's no longer a criminal case. If there was a clear exception, that now is gone when the officers doesn't decide to file a charge. No charges, no investigation. That's how we would handle that. That would be a public record.
Well, I was always, during my career, if there's clear evidence of domestic violence, the officer does not have an option. If she called and then they responded to the house and there was clear evidence of violence and domestic violence, then the officers had no choice but to arrest the individual. And I don't know if that's still in place. I've been gone for 12 years, 14 years, but I don't know.
It is still the law, but in this case they determined that was not the case, and there were no charges filed here, which is why it was released. It did not fall under the confidential law enforcement exception.
Go ahead. Question.
But what if you have a buildup of circumstances involving this individual where you have repeated calls out? Would you then still argue that what's the next time she gets called and she is beat up or there are charges filed? That video, under your thought process, you would release because there are charges filed, but would you still not release this one? Because
no, this in my mind is a public record right off the bat. No charges were filed. This is public.
But to clarify, you're saying you don't think it should be, that's an area where we need a new exemption?
No. Well, in this situation,
to cover these types
if I had my druthers, that since there was no force used on the part of the police officer, it's in someone's private home, it doesn't fall under any exception. The clearest exception is not applicable to this. What I hope we would do is we would redact some of this in the best of all. It's a private residence. I don't know why the public needs to see this. And let me just say one last and significant thing. The test is not whether mainstream media would put this on their website. That's not the issue here. The question is whether it's a public record and what's the significance of that. If you go right now, go on YouTube, type in the words police body camera, you will bring up over 750 websites, over 250,000 body camera films that people have posted onto YouTube. Some of these folks make money off posting these footages because of the hits they render. And I do think that we need some commonsensical, and I don't think we're in disagreement on this, additional exemptions under Ohio records law to prohibit this voyeurism and to better balance the issue of transparency and privacy.
Any other comments before I move on to the
Yeah,
next
just one more thing. George mentioned a bunch of situations earlier that he thought were problematic in domestic violence cases. People were beat up, people were bleeding, so on and so forth. The way you deal with that situation is what he was just talking about now. It seems to me you can redact those portions, you can blur faces, you can blur somebody lying on the ground in a pool of blood if it comes to that, which is a separate issue from whether the document itself, the footage itself should be a public record, which I think it should.
I agree.
All right, let's go to the next video. Good discussion. This kind of gets at the issue that Peter alluded to in the earlier comments about the Sonny Kim case. How far is too far when it's showing violence, or is there a different standard that we should have for transparency if the victim is a government employee, particularly a law enforcement officer? So I'm just going to go ahead and play this for you.
Flagstaff police releasing that body camera video. It is chilling as it shows the officer approaching the suspect in a domestic violence case. Everything seems very normal until that suspect suddenly pulls a gun.
Is there anything I can do between you guys? You need someone to exchange the keys, or?
The video from Officer Tyler Stewart's body camera begins in his patrol car on the afternoon of Saturday, December 27th. The 24-year-old officer out looking for a suspect in a domestic violence case. He found the man, 28-year-old Robert Smith, in a neighborhood off West Clay Avenue in Flagstaff. Officer Stewart calmly questions Smith about what happened between him and his girlfriend.
You don't have any weapons in your pockets or anything like that?
No, sir, I'm just cold.
Okay.
My tooth has not let me eat in days.
Okay. How bad is the pain?
On a scale of 1 to 10, like a 12.
Like a 12?
It shoots up to here, here, here.
Okay. Okay. So, I was in the area. Got some other calls coming in, but I thought I'd swing by.
During their conversation, Stewart asks to search Smith to make sure he doesn't have any weapons, and things change in a split second.
You mind if I just pat down your pockets real quick? You don't have anything in here?
No.
Okay. Nothing in here?
No, this is my smoke.
Okay.
The video too graphic to show from here, but Flagstaff PD says you hear 3 gunshots and the camera goes to the ground. Then 3 more shots from Smith's .22 caliber handgun. The body camera moves slightly, all within a 4-second time frame. After the 6th shot, there is 9 seconds of silence on the video, followed by what investigators believe is the sound of Officer Stewart's service weapon cycling. Then a 7th and final round is heard. Officer Stewart was pronounced dead a short time later. Flagstaff police releasing that body camera video.
Okay, a couple issues here. It's not a private property issue. One of you just alluded to it. Most traditional mainstream media outlets would not run that video, the full video, when it's available. There obviously are outlets that will run that. That's something I hear a lot from legislators in my lobbying role is, well, I know you guys wouldn't, publish the full text of that or run that video, but what about this guy's blog or this guy's website? And that's a real issue out there, but, protecting the public from seeing that also means that there's going to be less access to that information, sometimes for, very good reasons. So, I'll turn it over to the panel. What are some of the issues you see in this? How far is too far, or should this all be an open record?
Well, let me say that the mainstream media here said it was too graphic to show. That did not stop an individual from posting the video in its entirety on YouTube. It has since been taken down, but that is a great example of what I was referring to earlier. Once it's a public record, it's not just confined to mainstream media. Anyone can post these things. Secondly, that's a public record. The individual killed the officer, and if you keep showing the video, the individual then shot himself, committed suicide. There is no investigation. Investigation's over. Does not fall under the clear exception. So that is why that video was given out. And I think that's a horrible example of, and where we need some redaction abilities in Ohio law. Under Ohio law, that's public in its entirety.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm just...
That reporter was able to state some things with the authority he did because he was able to see the whole video. He didn't use the whole video, but he was able to make some statements about what continued on. Had that been redacted, immediately some things would have come into question on the reporter's mind because he didn't see it, and therefore on the audience's mind because they don't see it. I just think that some of this argument for redaction says, let's take this information out of the public view because we don't like that people want to see it. Because you have to go looking for it to get it on YouTube. But at the same time, we're defeating the whole purpose of what public records are supposed to do, which is give the public confidence in their institutions of government. And each thing you take away from the public's ability to confirm on their own, you're defeating your own purpose.
There are some extremely sensitivity issues and concerns that, say, the family of the officer to every day turn on and there it is, and that raises the question: is there some type of legislation that could protect the family, whether it's the victim of a police officer being killed or the victim of a average citizen's family? That's out there. And then there's the other side of that is there are some family members, if they feel that their family member was killed by a police officer, they want the world to see what that officer did to their family member. So we were kind of in a situation where I agree that being a law enforcement officer, I would not want to see an officer being shot and killed and all of what happened in this video and others. I would not want to see that on a regular basis. So, but there's no problem showing the Sam Dubose situation. We saw that over and over and over again. So we probably do need some form of legislation, but what would that look like?
That's the tricky part. Others?
Well, I think that's the tricky part. I mean, as a human being, I don't have any desire to see the officer being shot any more than I did in the case of the Sonny Kim video. In the video we ran, he was pixelated, so you couldn't see him, alas, bleeding out on the side on the street. The hard part, I think, is while agreeing with the sentiment, it's how do you write a law stipulating how redaction works? Who ultimately has the authority to decide what's redacted? One of the problems we have with public records law of all sort, local, federal, state, is, of course, the agencies decide what they redact, and as we have an ongoing dispute with the authorities in Pike County right now over autopsy reports in those cases, basically they redacted everything except, I'm overstating it, but the day of the week. And they redacted everything that they knew we didn't know yet. They left in everything that they knew we knew. So I think I said that right. But anyway, the hard part is figuring out exactly how that works. We live in such a coarse society already. I mean, I was watching a TV program with my wife last night that she likes, and I was being a good spouse and watching with her instead of going upstairs and watching the baseball game. And at the end, a guy commits suicide, and there's a blood spatter all over one of the principals in the show. And I'm sort of going, man, I just don't need to see this, even in a TV show, when you know it's a TV show and it's fake. But so figuring out that whole role that redaction plays, I think, is very, very complicated, and there's a slippery slope issue too from a media point of view within it. Mike wants to.
If I could just add, I think you raise a very good point about the redaction and letting people see, what's actually going on. I think the ideal in redaction is, you show pretty much everything. You just pixelate out, or you obscure, faces or pools of blood or whatever it is that's at issue, but you see how the whole thing transpired. So it's not like you're cutting out 20 seconds here and 30 seconds there, at least.
Agreed.
Yeah, okay.
Agreed. And by the way, the technology to do that is evolving better and better all the time. The one thing that does scare me by advocating redaction as opposed to not releasing, as what other states have done, is again this potential 4-to-1 ratio of redaction time. It greatly scares me. For example, we may have a major situation, 20 officers are there for 2 hours, that's 40 hours of film. If you multiply that by 4, that's 160 hours that somebody's gonna have to sit there and go through each one of those body cam recordings in order to give that public record up. And quite frankly, when you see the moving around, I get motion sickness very easily. I couldn't do that job.
Michael, did you have a question?
I have the same problem.
Yeah.
For Mr. Speaks, you mentioned that you thought this was a closed case because the suspect killed himself.
Yeah.
If he had fled instead and was not found or found alive 3 hours later, is it still a closed case?
It has the potential at that point, he's not found yet, let's say. He's still out. It has the potential of being an ongoing investigation. It would be up to the discretion of that.
Did everyone hear the question?
These things go on forever and ever. It's open cases, that it's open case until it goes, if he had lived and is tried a year and a half later for the crime, that's still a sealed record until that time. That's where my concern comes in when you say that.
Well, we're talking about this subject of privacy. I would ask the panel and maybe some of the younger people in the room to react to this, because most of us are at boomer level, et cetera. Is the sense of privacy also sort of a generational thing? Are younger people less uptight about privacy and the fact that all this stuff you do might be on video? Is the older generation more concerned about protecting privacy? Is this an issue that might become less important as the years go by in the world we're in today?
And put it in context, we have about 100 homicides a year in the city of Columbus. Would you like to see 100 more graphic videos, more so than this?
Because privacy is really the elephant in the room in figuring out where this body camera stuff goes, and what price are we going to pay the more we restrict in terms of the transparency goals of using it. I saw somebody out there.
Yeah. I cover the city of Columbus for the Dispatch, so I've seen a lot of these videos that the director shared. One of them, I don't know if you have it up there, is a video of a woman in a bar busted for underage drinking, and she's wearing very little clothing. And it's a provocative video. I think a lot of sites that show that type of footage of women would get it and put it up because she's not dressed, I would say, properly. But to answer your question, I think people go after that video and you have to ask yourself, why do they want that video? It's because of the way she looks. And should that be public then, just because that's why they want it? Because if it was a guy, they probably wouldn't want it if they were dressed in a trench coat versus just a tank top. But I will say to your question about, when you're younger, I think that stuff matters less to you. But being almost 40 now, it would matter to me now. And we get calls in our newsroom of people who, when they were younger, did dumb stuff, got in the paper, and would like us to eliminate that article, that picture from the internet for them. And I think as they get older, it becomes more of a big deal to them.
Did you have that video? If you want to key that up.
Which one?
Underage.
Yeah.
She's underage drinking. Yeah, she's underage and drinking from.
That's the one from Orlando.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll show that next. Yes.
I can't say whether it's a generational gap in the sense of transparency.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, I apologize. I can't say whether the issue more so is generational in terms of transparency versus privacy, but I think like one of the members up there mentioned that even if things are not released through the media, people will definitely seek their own ways to find out that information, and I feel like because of that, I've seen more of a shift. I think that people are definitely more interested in making sure that they get the information that they need, whether it's shown or not. So I would just have to say that perhaps privacy, not that it's not as important, but seeking out the truth in our own means has become a lot more prominent, at least with my generation I've seen.
Go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah. Well, as a student reporter, I don't think that the newest generation is like less concerned with privacy than the older generation, because I go out and I try to interview students and many of them won't speak to me. Like, I consistently have a problem getting them to open up to me, because even though this generation puts a lot out on social media, they're in control of their own image, and they don't want to speak to reporters because they want to control what they say and what people think of them. So it's like, people talk all about millennials and how they aren't concerned with privacy, but I think they are more than people realize.
I'm going to show, I will achieve my goal of showing this one kind of speaks.
What's your birthday?
123. I'm trying to go home. I'm fine. Seriously, I'm seriously just trying to get out here.
How old are you?
I'm 18. I live by myself here.
How did you get in?
With an ID that's in my phone case.
That's good. What we're going to do is this. I'm going to write you a quick ticket, and I'll get you out of here. I'm not going to arrest you. Okay?
Thank you.
My
friend has my keys, though.
Okay, well, you can go back in as far as I'm concerned.
I can't find him, is my thing. Like, I don't even have my normal ID on me.
Okay. Well, I can run you in the system.
Okay.
All right, but you understand you can go to jail for this, right?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay. And you're 18?
Yeah.
So you have two options to take care of this.
Okay.
The first option is you can pay a fine. The second option is you can contest it, okay?
Okay.
If you want to pay the fine, it's explained right here. I don't know the fine. You have to call the clerk of the court. If you want to contest it, it's May 22nd, 8 a.m. at that location. What do you think happens if you ignore this?
You get arrested.
You're going to get...
I have to call to find out how much it is?
Yeah,
Okay.
right. If you just ignore it, one day you're going to get stopped by a cop, and they're going to say, hey, you have a warrant for your arrest, and they're going to take you to jail.
Okay.
So out of all the things to go to jail for, missing a ticket where you can pay a fine is not it.
Okay.
Orlando Sentinel newspaper, check it out.
It was a party, sorry.
It's our party.
So if I may, the director and I got into a pretty heated discussion about this because I felt the committee that he was working on, they wanted to redact this type of footage or keep it from the public, just because now forever on the internet, no matter how old that woman gets, the image of her on the internet will be her scantily clad, getting questioned by an officer about drinking when she's 18. And my point was, if she had been dressed in a trench coat or anything else, then that video, we wouldn't be watching that video if she was dressed in a trench coat. The fact that it got posted was because I think, and there was discussion about this, of the way she looked. And I don't think, my point was you shouldn't be able to redact or keep from the public that type of footage just because of the way someone looks.
So my son was a high schooler looking at colleges. I have told him recently, look at your social media accounts. They have a zillion accounts now, stuff that above my head. Because I've been told by our high school guidance counselor, college admissions counselors are now reviewing the kids, the applicants' social media. Youthful indiscretion can have long-lasting effects, not only in terms of college, but even employment situations, et cetera, for a number of years. And again, this is posted to the YouTube for who knows how long.
I guess my thought on this situation is she's not 17, she's 18. She's in the public, dressed that way. So at that point, the situation is totally different because she is considered old enough. She can't drink, she can't do all of that, but she's considered an adult at 18. And there was no expectation on her part of privacy going into the club looking like that. I can see it still being public information, but redacting, the parts of her body that look a little overboard.
Others? Lou?
She's out in public. She chose the way she dressed. She got in trouble for underage drinking. She's an adult. Too bad. Sorry.
So let me ask you this question. Let me go back to my youthful indiscretion days. It's 1982 in the back seat of a car with Journey playing on the cassette deck, and there's a knock at the window, and it's Sergeant Preston. Sergeant Preston was my next door neighbor who said, "Speaks, if you guys aren't out of here in 5 minutes, I'm telling your mother." Today, Sergeant Preston would have a body camera. Same types of issues, guys. No, there's no current exemption for nudity or, quite frankly, sex in Ohio Revised Code. Should those videos be a public record? I would hope that we'll get some legislation in order to redact such youthful indiscretion.
So here's what's interesting about that to me, and it's about the interesting nature of video and to some extent still photography. When I was a police reporter a million years ago, I might see a police report that said George Speaks was arrested with a nude woman in his car listening to Journey, whatever.
Unexpected privacy in the backseat.
No accounting for taste, right? So, and I would have that report, and the papers I worked for, some were smaller papers. If it moved in Galesburg, Illinois, it got in the paper. I think their motto was, if you don't want it in the paper, don't do it. You know? And that's kind of how it was for a lot of us, right? Who were in the business. And it would be bad, and I could see George's dad might have even showed up in my editor's office begging him to take it, not run it, and the editor would have pulled out the story that we had done on his DUI arrest and said, sorry, and it would have run. Video is different. But why should it be treated differently? And that's my devil's advocate question of the group. It's different in the way we perceive it somehow because of the image, but it's not really functionally different than that description. So why should we be carving out these exceptions when you consider the value in many cases, certainly to journalists, of being able to see the complete video, to your point earlier. Can you guys talk about that a little bit?
Well, when you start carving out, now you're going down a slippery slope. But you would not show the actual Georgia nude in the back seat. I mean, you could blur all of that out.
Whoa. Stop right there. Under current law, that's a public record in its entirety.
Okay.
There is no means available under current law to redact such a video.
Well, this is why, again, when we start talking about public records in its entirety, that becomes obviously questionable. So blurring out, as we've done so often with police officers lying in a pool of blood on the street,
which under current law, there is no ability to do. Somebody may have done that, but if pressed, you have to give out the video in the entirety.
This is why we're having this discussion, you all.
Lou, Peter, any final comments in our last minute?
Sort of the same comment. I'm completely sensitive to what Mr. Speaks is talking about, but who decides? Who writes the exemption for 18-year-old girls going into bars underaged and underdressed? I mean, it becomes so subjective to the point of, I think we can find common ground on things like not showing victims of domestic violence or sexual violence. But so many of the other things are in such gray areas that the exemptions need to be very carefully carved and need to be very few, in my opinion. It's easy to take an absolutist view, like many of us do on the First Amendment and so on. But even on the First Amendment, there's sort of the don't yell fire in a crowded theater exemption. I don't think that has legal standing, but it's, common practice. So if we can find a middle ground, but I just don't know who ends up saying this can be redacted and this can't. I mean, I think that's awfully hard for a legislative body to solve. So in general, I would oppose doing that except on very limited bases.
Absolutely agree with that. The problem with all this, of course, is the internet, because if this stuff wasn't out there forever for anybody who wanted to look at it, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation right now.
I'll simply say body cameras sounds easy, but once the devil is always in the details, and there's this continual rub of values, transparency we want, but yet we want to preserve privacy, and that balance is the tricky part.
And I think we, having this discussion, we can find that common ground. It just have to continue to discuss this issue. There will always be opportunities for changing, but I think we're on the right track in trying to find some common ground.
Please join me in thanking our panel.